The final stage after an avoidant relationship ends is the stage that decides everything, because this is where two very different paths appear, and only one of them leads to peace when time has passed, and the emotional fog begins to lift. You start seeing the relationship clearly, not through longing, not through pain, but through truth, and truth has a strange way of settling quietly inside. You begin to understand that the connection was real, but the capacity was not. You stop romanticizing the struggle, you stop calling inconsistency passion, you stop calling emotional absence independence, and this clarity doesn't come suddenly, it arrives in small moments, like when you no longer feel the urge to check their social media, or when their name no longer triggers anxiety in your chest, or when you realize an entire day passed without thinking about them, and instead of panic you feel relief. This is the moment where healing actually starts, because healing is not about forgetting, it's about remembering without bleeding. And while you are slowly rebuilding yourself, the avoidant is usually doing what they have always done, avoiding introspection, avoiding stillness, avoiding accountability. They fill their time with noise, work, people, situations, anything that keeps them from sitting alone with their emotions, because silence eventually forces reflection, and reflection forces responsibility, and responsibility threatens the identity they have built around emotional self-protection. They may tell themselves they are happier now, they may believe they are healed because they are not hurting, but numbness is not healing. And independence without intimacy is not freedom, it's isolation disguised as strength. And this is why avoidants often repeat the same story with different people. Because without inner work, the pattern survives, the face changes, the beginning feels exciting again, and they convince themselves this time is different, but what they don't realize is that the trigger was never the partner, it was intimacy itself, and intimacy always returns once attachment forms, and when it does, the same fear activates, the same withdrawal happens, and another ending quietly writes itself, while you on the other hand begin to experience something new, stability within yourself. You stop seeking validation outside, you stop over-explaining your feelings, you stop shrinking to keep someone comfortable. And this inner stability changes the way you connect with others, you become more selective, more grounded, less reactive. And when a new connection appears, you notice the difference immediately. Consistency, no mixed signals, emotional presence without pressure, communication without fear. And at first, it may feel unfamiliar because chaos once felt like chemistry, but over time your nervous system learns that peace is not boring, it's safe. And this is the transformation avoidant relationships often create. They break you open, so you can rebuild correctly, not with walls, but with boundaries, not with fear, but with discernment. And this is why many people look back and say that relationship changed me forever, because it did. It forced you to confront your attachment wounds, your tolerance for emotional neglect, your fear of abandonment. And through that confrontation you grew, while the avoidant stayed the same. And sometimes years later, they may resurface, not dramatically, not apologetically, but curiously. They may ask how you are, they may hint at nostalgia, they may subtly test if the door is still open. And in that moment, you feel the difference, because the old version of you would have felt hope, your heart would have raced, your mind would have filled with what ifs, but now there is calm. You respond, if you choose to, from a place of neutrality, not longing. And that neutrality is the clearest sign that the story is over, not because you hate them, not because you won, but because you no longer need anything from them. And that is the ending avoidants fear the most, because it means they no longer hold emotional power, and power was never about control. It was about access, access to your care, your forgiveness, your availability. And once that access is gone, the dynamic dies completely. They may never say it out loud, but this is often when regret surfaces quietly, not regret for the breakup, but regret for not being able to love the way they wanted to love, regret for not being able to stay when things mattered, regret for losing someone who would have stayed through the storm if they had learned how to stand in it. And this regret doesn't lead to change most of the time, because change requires courage and vulnerability. And avoidants only change when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the fear of growth, and many never reach that point. But you don't need them to change for your story to end. You don't need an apology, you don't need closure, you don't need understanding, because closure comes from integration, from accepting that the relationship was both meaningful and limited, that it taught you something essential about love and about yourself, and that it ended not because you were too much, but because they were emotionally unavailable. And this acceptance frees you from resentment, because resentment keeps you tied to the past, and freedom means emotional neutrality, not indifference, but peace. And one day, when you think about them, it feels like thinking about a chapter that shaped you but no longer defines you. You feel gratitude for the lesson, compassion for their wounds, and pride for your growth. And this is the final ending of every avoidant relationship, not reunion, not revenge, not validation, but evolution. One person evolves through awareness and healing, other remains guarded, repeating cycles until they choose to face themselves, and the paths never cross again in the same way, because once you learn what secure love feels like, you never mistake emotional distance for depth again. And that is how the story truly ends, quietly, clearly, and completely, with you choosing yourself and never looking back. What finally remains after everything has settled, after the emotions have cooled, and the memories no longer sting, is a quiet understanding that this relationship was never meant to be finished together, but it was meant to finish something inside you, and this realization arrives softly, not with fireworks, not with tears, but with a deep calm that feels unfamiliar at first. Because for so long, your nervous system was trained to stay alert, waiting for messages, waiting for shifts in tone, waiting for signs of withdrawal. And now there is nothing to wait for, and that emptiness feels strange until you realize it is not emptiness at all, it is space, and space is where growth lives. This is the stage where you fully detach, not by force, but by clarity. You stop telling the story of what happened, you stop explaining it to others, you stop replaying it in your own mind, because the lesson has been integrated. You know now that love without emotional safety is not love. You know that consistency is not too much to ask for. You know that someone who wants you does not make you guess. And this knowing changes the way you carry yourself. You stand differently, you speak differently, you choose differently. And this is something avoidants sense even from a distance, because avoidance is not just behavior. It is sensitivity to emotional shifts. And when they sense that you are no longer emotionally available in the way you once were, it creates a quiet disruption inside them, not enough to make them change, but enough to make them feel the weight of what was lost, not the fantasy, but the real connection, the steady presence, the patience, the depth they once had access to without knowing how rare it was. And this is where the final emotional loop closes, because avoidant relationships often leave one person addicted to hope, and once hope is gone, the attachment dissolves completely. You are no longer tied to potential, you are grounded in reality, and reality shows you that someone who runs when things become real cannot walk with you into the life you are building. And this acceptance does not harden your heart, it softens it in a healthier way. You become less reactive, more discerning. You stop trying to prove your worth to emotionally unavailable people, and instead you reserve your energy for connections that feel mutual, balanced, and calm. And this calm becomes your new baseline. Not excitement, not intensity, but peace. And when peace becomes familiar, chaos loses its attraction. And this is the deepest transformation avoidant relationships offer. They teach you to trust your inner signals. They teach you to honor your needs. They teach you that love should feel safe, not confusing. And meanwhile, the avoidant continues forward, carrying the same unresolved patterns into new dynamics. They may appear happy, they may appear fulfilled, but beneath the surface, the same fears remain, because avoidance does not disappear without conscious work. And many avoidants confuse movement with growth. They change locations, partners, routines, but never address the core wound: fear of dependency, fear of loss of self, fear of vulnerability. And because of this, their endings never truly end. They carry fragments of unfinished emotional business with them, while you complete the cycle within yourself. And this completion is powerful, because it means they no longer have emotional access to you, not because you blocked them, not because you are angry, but because you are whole, and wholeness does not cling to what cannot meet it. And one day, perhaps much later, you may hear about them through others, or see them briefly, and feel nothing but a distant neutrality. And that neutrality confirms everything you needed to know. The bond has dissolved fully, the lesson has been learned, and the version of you who once waited, questioned, and doubted no longer exists. And this is where your story expands beyond that relationship. You create deeper friendships, healthier romantic connections, and a stronger relationship with yourself. You no longer abandon yourself to keep someone close. You no longer negotiate your needs. You no longer fear being too much, because you know the right connection will never require you to be less. And this self-trust becomes your foundation. And from this foundation, you build a life that is emotionally aligned, not driven by fear or scarcity, but by clarity and self-respect. And this is the ending avoidant relationships are unable to provide, because avoidants leave questions unanswered, emotions unspoken, and endings unresolved. But you resolve it by choosing yourself fully, by closing the door gently without resentment. and by walking forward without looking back. And that is the true final chapter, not reunion, not explanation, not validation. Self-ownership and emotional freedom. And once you reach this point, the relationship no longer holds meaning beyond the lesson it gave, and lessons once learned no longer need to repeat. And that is how the story finally completes, not with their change, but with yours, not with their return, but with your release, not with closure given, but with closure created. And that is the final ending of every avoidant relationship, when one person stops waiting for love that runs and starts living a life that stays. The last phase is not about them anymore, even though their shadow may still pass through your mind from time to time, because this phase belongs entirely to you. And what changes now is not your feelings, but your identity. You no longer define yourself by what you endured, or what you lost. You define yourself by what you learned, and who you became because of it. And this shift is subtle, permanent. It shows up in the way you no longer chase emotional availability. You no longer feel drawn to people who are inconsistent, distant, or confusing. You sense it early, and instead of trying harder, you step back calmly, because your nervous system has been retrained to recognize safety over intensity. And this is something that only happens after deep emotional lessons, and avoidant relationships are often the catalyst for this level of growth, because they force you to confront your own attachment patterns, your fear of being left, your tolerance for uncertainty, and the parts of you that once believed love had to be earned through patience or sacrifice. And once those beliefs dissolve, you stop negotiating with yourself, you stop minimizing your needs, you stop accepting half presence as enough, and this inner alignment creates a quiet confidence, not loud, not performative, but grounded. And people respond to it differently. You notice that conversations feel easier, connections feel more balanced, and you are no longer overgiving to feel secure. You give because you want to, not because you are afraid of losing someone. And this is the kind of love avoidants rarely experience, because it requires mutual presence and emotional courage. And while you are building something stable within and around you, the avoidant remains in motion, not necessarily unhappy, but never fully settled, because avoidance keeps them in a state of emotional suspension, always close but never anchored, always connected but never deeply rooted. And this becomes their quiet struggle, not dramatic, not obvious, but persistent. They may sense that something is missing, but without self-reflection they cannot name it. And without naming it they cannot heal it. And this is why their endings never bring true peace, while yours does, because you faced the discomfort instead of running from it. You stayed present through grief. You processed the loss. You allowed yourself to feel everything. And in doing so you freed yourself from repeating the same story. And one day you realize that the relationship no longer defines your standards, it helped create them. You no longer ask, will this person leave? You ask, can this person stay emotionally present? When things get hard, you no longer fear being alone, because you have learned how to be with yourself without abandoning your needs. And this self-trust becomes the foundation for all future relationships, not just romantic, but with friends, family, and even yourself. You speak more honestly, you listen to your intuition, you act sooner when something feels off, and you no longer wait for proof that someone cares. You observe their consistency and let actions speak. And this is where your story diverges completely from theirs, because growth changes your trajectory while avoidance keeps theirs looping. And this divergence is final, not because you cut them off, but because you no longer resonate on the same emotional frequency. And people only stay connected when they grow in compatible directions. And this truth brings peace, not bitterness, compassion, not resentment, because you understand that everyone is doing the best they can with the tools they have. And you no longer need them to become something else for you to feel complete. And this is the ultimate freedom. You carry the lesson without carrying the wound. You remember without longing. You acknowledge without attachment. And you move forward grounded, open, and emotionally available to a love that does not require you to wait, shrink, or wonder. And this is the real conclusion, not a dramatic ending, but a mature one where the chapter closes gently and life continues richer, calmer, and more aligned. And that is the final truth of every avoidant relationship. It ends not when they walk away, but when you no longer need them to come back. And that moment changes everything.